the heart of an old, forgotten neighborhood, on the outskirts of the city, Max dragged his feet up a worn stone staircase, heading to the fourth floor, where his new apartment awaited. The building was nearly abandoned, most of the windows shattered, the facades eroded by years of neglect. Rain fell endlessly, and the sky was so clouded that night seemed darker than usual. He reached the rusty door at the end of a long corridor. The lock was so old that the key barely turned. He pushed with his shoulder, and the door let out a strange moan, like a dying creature. From the moment he stepped across the threshold, the cold doubled, as if the apartment was wrapped in a wall of invisible ice. A thick stench of mold mixed with a sharp metallic odor, like old blood, crept into his nose, almost choking him. The walls were cracked, the peeling paint forming long, twisted lines that looked like outstretched fingers reaching for something to hold. The rotting wooden floor groaned softly under each step, as though it were in pain beneath his weight. At first he thought the dim yellow light from the ceiling lamp might give him some comfort, but the bulb began to flicker slowly, then suddenly went out. Darkness swallowed the place whole, and faint, whisper-like sounds echoed in his ears from far away. Max stood still, listening, trying to convince himself it was only the sound of rain on the windows. But then he felt cold breath on his neck. He turned quickly. No one, just still air. His heart started pounding hard, his hands trembling. As he moved cautiously deeper inside, he noticed an old, torn curtain swaying, even though the windows were tightly shut. He approached, staring, then, with a shaking hand, pulled the ragged fabric aside. Behind it was a cracked wall, and at its center a large metal frame coated in thick dust. He blew on it, revealing an old mirror with black spots and rusty edges. Max lifted his eyes to its surface, and what he saw froze his blood. His reflection wasn't whole. Only half his face appeared clearly, the other half was drowned in shifting black shadows, moving like smoke. Worse still, his mirrored features moved out of sync with his real ones. He leaned closer, eyes widening in shock. The reflection was smiling, a crooked grin he didn't recognize, a smile that didn't belong to him. The eyes in the glass followed him, but they didn't blink. It was as if the mirror stored a version of him, older, deeper, and far more sinister. He slowly raised his hand and touched the cold surface. A strange sensation spread through his fingers, not the hardness of glass, but a slick, clammy texture that sent shivers down his spine. He jerked back, watching as the black shadows in the mirror's dark half thickened, forming the shape of a human figure standing directly behind him. He stumbled backwards, crashing against the wall, his gaze still locked on the mirror. The being inside raised its hands slowly, as if preparing to reach out beyond the frame. That grin stretched wider, splitting the distorted face, and within it gleamed a darkness as deep as a bottomless lake. Max's heart quivered, sweat dripping down his forehead despite the freezing air. The atmosphere grew heavier, the stench of mold stronger, and the shadows on the walls began to dance slowly around him. He felt something watching him from every direction, something unseen yet undeniably present, waiting for the right moment to step out of the dark into his world. In that instant, Max understood this apartment was no ordinary place, and the mirror was no mere piece of old decor. There was something on the other side, something alive, watching him, and perhaps trying to become him. A week had passed since Max moved into the apartment. He tried to ignore the old mirror embedded in the wall, pretending it didn't exist. But every time he entered the room, he felt its eyes on him. Nights in this apartment were longer than anywhere else. 3 in the morning felt endless, and even the air itself seemed to press heavier on his chest once darkness fell.
It began with a faint sound, something like the wind, but he noticed it came specifically from the mirror's direction. On the first night, he ignored it. On the second, he turned up the TV to drown it out. On the third, he switched the TV off and sat in the dark, listening. The sound was a broken whisper, whispering his name. He felt the mirror reflected not just his body, but his thoughts as well, as though it was waiting for just one more glance to begin something greater. Each time he drew closer, the air grew colder, the smell thicker, a scent of rusty metal mixed with something else he couldn't identify. One night, he suddenly awoke at 3:15 a.m. with the strange sensation that someone was sitting beside him on the bed. Slowly, he lifted his head, his heart pounding against his chest. The room was cloaked in darkness, except for a thin line of pale light slipping under the door. He reached out to switch on the lamp, but his hand trembled uncontrollably. From the corner of the room where the mirror stood came a faint tapping sound. Once, twice, 3 times. His eyes lifted, and in the darkness he saw a faint white patch, his face in the mirror, but half of it was shrouded in shadow, while the other half smiled a smile he didn't recognize. He froze. He didn't dare move. Heavy breaths brushed against his ear, breaths that weren't his own. The voice rose louder until it became clear. Max. The voice was a mixture of his own and that of an unfamiliar woman, soft yet deep, as though it were rising from underground. He shut his eyes, trying to wake as if from a nightmare, but when he opened them again, he was standing directly in front of the mirror without remembering how he got there. His fingers were pressed against the cold surface. His reflection stared back at him with utterly still eyes, then curved its lips into a crooked smile. Terrified, he staggered backward, bumping into a chair and collapsing to the floor. He sat there, staring at the mirror, his breath uneven, sweat pouring despite the cold air. The apartment was silent except for that whisper that now slithered through his mind. You are mine. You are mine. By morning, Max woke still sitting on the floor before the mirror, his eyes bloodshot as though he hadn't slept at all, his clothes damp with sweat. Everything in the room was in its place, except for one detail. In the corner of the mirror's glass were black fingerprints pressed from the inside, as though something had been trying to claw its way out all night. Max stepped into the street, attempting to convince himself it was all just psychological pressure, but deep down he knew the truth. Something alive was in that mirror, something that knew his name, and something that was waiting for the right moment to cross over.
Max spent the next day trying to escape the apartment. He slept for hours in cafes, wandered aimlessly through the streets, yet by sunset he always found himself back there, as if some invisible thread was pulling him toward the mirror. At first, he began noticing something small but recurring. His image was disappearing from certain places. On his phone, for example, every recent selfie turned black or blurry, while photos of other people remained normal. He thought the camera was broken, but when he tried to take a new picture, his face appeared distorted, his eyes replaced by 2 dark voids. Hours later, he discovered that old photos of him on his computer files had started changing as well. Instead of his face, a dark shadow stood in the same position. Even his ID cards were beginning to lose his features, as though his very existence was being erased from reality. That night, he sat in the living room staring at the mirror. His reflection was now whole, but it wasn't him. Deep shadows sagged under its eyes. A faint, fixed smile lingered on its lips, and its skin was pale like plaster. The reflection was watching him, staring as if it were waiting for him to speak. He tried to look away, but felt a strange force pulling his gaze back. The longer he stared, the dizzier he became. The air around him grew heavier, the metallic stench stronger than ever. In his head, a short phrase repeated in a dead voice, "You don't need a picture. You are the picture." He leapt to his feet, ready to smash the mirror, but stopped. Inside him rose a feeling stronger than fear, a certainty that breaking it would unleash something far worse. He took a deep breath, left the room, and slammed the door shut. That night, Max dreamed he was in a long hallway lined with mirrors. Each one reflected a different version of him, one with black eyes, one with gray skin, one without a mouth, one without a body. Even at the very end stood the original mirror, the one that smiled at him and reached out to touch him. When he woke, his palm was cold and wet, as if he had really touched something. He unlocked his phone only to find all his photos gone, except for one he didn't remember taking, an image of himself sleeping in front of the mirror. His face was pale, smiling, and in the corner behind him stood a tall shadow, staring directly into the camera. He checked the clock, 3:13 a.m. The house was still, but from the mirror came a faint tapping. Once, twice, 3 times. Max was beginning to realize this was no longer just a strange reflection, but a process of erasure and replacement. Something in the mirror was slowly draining his existence, erasing his image from the world so it could take his place. At last, he lifted his eyes to the glass and asked in a trembling voice, "What do you want from me?" The reflection never opened its mouth, but he heard the answer inside his head. "You want to be you."
The fourth night was quieter than ever. The rain had stopped, the street below the apartment lay empty except for broken streetlights. Max sat rigid in the middle of the room, trying to convince himself that everything he was living through was just a long nightmare. But when he lifted his head toward the mirror, he realized his reflection no longer mimicked his movements. The reflection stared directly at him without moving its lips. Max raised his hand. The reflection did not. Max turned his head to the right. The reflection turned to the left, as if they were two completely different beings. The reflection gave a slow, cold smile, then deliberately moved its lips to form words Max could not hear but easily read. "You have stepped out of yourself." A sharp chill shot down his spine. He jumped to his feet and backed away, crashing against the wall. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier, the metallic stench shifting into the smell of grave soil. The farther he moved from the mirror, the closer the reflection leaned forward, as though pressing toward the glass. Max lifted a trembling hand, ready to cover the surface with a cloth, but when he drew near, he saw a long shadow moving slowly behind the reflection. It looked like him, only larger, its head tilted unnaturally as if broken, its eyes glowing with a faint, sickly light. Suddenly, the room's light began to fade until it was gone. In the darkness, Max felt a cold hand rest on his shoulder. He spun violently. Nothing there. When his eyes shot back to the mirror, the reflection now stood directly behind him within the glass, closer than ever, its mouth nearing his ear. A deep voice whispered inside his head, one that was nothing like his own. Now the game begins. His whole body trembled. He could no longer tell what was happening outside the mirror and what was happening within. Sounds and colors bled into each other. Even the shapes of the furniture in the room twisted inside the glass, warping and melting as if they were dissolving. Max stretched out his hand to touch the mirror's surface, but this time it pulsed beneath his fingers, like living flesh. He recoiled, collapsing onto the floor, crawling backward with wide, terrified eyes. The reflection pressed closer, its face flattening against the surface, grinning wide to reveal rows of sharp teeth. Its eyes were now nothing but bottomless black. At that moment, a voice split through Max's head, sharp and metallic like tearing steel. "Soon, I will be here."
The following night, Max decided he had to act. Sleep no longer came to him, and the apartment had ceased to feel like a place for living. He spent the entire day trying to find someone who would buy the mirror or even take it off his hands. But every antique shop or junk dealer refused the moment they saw its picture on his phone. One man even slammed the phone shut in his face as soon as he glimpsed it. He returned home carrying a heavy iron hammer, his heart pounding violently, but he had resolved to smash the mirror no matter what. He entered the room quietly. The mirror was still, his reflection standing within it, but this time it seemed farther away, as though trapped in another room. Step by step, he approached and raised the hammer. The instant he lifted it for the strike, everything changed. The surface turned black like ink, and his reflection vanished. In its place appeared another face, his own, but with gray skin, black eyes, and a wide grin carved across it like a wound. The deep voice rose from within the glass. "When you break me, you break yourself." Suddenly, cracks spread through the walls, not the mirror. Plaster rained down from the ceiling, the lights flickered violently on and off, and the air grew so heavy he had to gasp just to breathe. He swung the hammer at the mirror with all his strength, but the sound was muffled, as if he were striking flesh, not glass. The surface quivered but did not shatter. From within, a gray hand with unnaturally long fingers pressed against the surface until it bulged outward like living skin. Max staggered back, screaming, the hammer slipping from his hand. The mirror began to split, not shattering, but opening, turning into a black fissure that widened slowly like a door. A freezing vapor seeped out, carrying the stench of rusty blood. The gray hand stretched through, its fingers brushing the air of the room. The cold that radiated from it was like ice, yet he felt the faint pulse within the touch, as if it were alive. The whisper was clearer now, not just in his head, but all around him, echoing from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. "You are mine. You are the door." Max bolted for the apartment door, but found it sealed shut, fused into the wall. He pulled with all his strength, but the handle was so cold it burned his skin, freezing his fingers. When he turned back toward the mirror, half the creature's body had already emerged, its gray torso, dripping black hair, and eyes so deep they looked like bottomless wells. It raised its head and stared at Max, then opened its vast, endless mouth. From it came a sound like the wind, but deeper, like a slow, tearing roar that split his ears. Max stumbled into the farthest corner of the room, his whole body shaking, his eyes unable to look away. For the first time, he felt as though he was the one trapped inside the glass, while the creature was the real one. There was no longer any barrier between Max and the entity.
except for a thin layer of glass that shrank with each passing second. The crack in the mirror had become a black doorway, swallowing the light. The icy wind pouring from it carried the stench of rust, and something older than rust, the smell of drowned graves. Max pressed himself against the wall, gasping as though the air were being pulled from his chest. The floor beneath his feet had grown slick, damp, as if water were seeping from the black fissure into the room. A second hand emerged from the mirror, long, thin, ending in needle-like claws. Then the shoulders, the neck, and finally the full face. It was his own, but with black eyes, gray skin, and a mouth slit up to the ears. The movements were slow, but relentless. When the creature stood half outside the mirror, Max felt as if he were looking at a dead version of himself, one that still pulsed with a grotesque life. The entity raised its head and spoke in a voice like his own, but deeper, echoing from the bottom of a well. "You've stared too long. Now you see me from the inside." It stepped forward, its feet sliding out of the mirror with no resistance, as though crossing a doorway. With each step it took, another lamp in the room went out, until the place was drowned in near total darkness, lit only by the faint, red glimmer burning in its eyes. Max tried to scream, but his voice strangled in his throat. The creature tilted its head slightly, grinning wide. "You are the door, and I am what comes through." In an instant, all the furniture vanished from the mirror's reflection. The room inside the glass was empty, except for shadows crawling across the floor, twisting into human shapes before melting away. The entity drew closer, until its face was inches from Max's. The temperature plummeted so sharply that Max's breath turned to white vapor. The creature lifted one finger and touched his forehead. The sensation was like scalding metal and freezing ice at the same time. With that touch, visions exploded in Max's mind. Himself standing in an endless hallway of mirrors. Himself being dragged into the glass, his silent scream echoing inside. Countless faces grinning at him from within. They were memories, but of a future he had not yet lived. Max screamed and lunged backward, his hand fumbling for anything to defend himself. He seized the iron hammer once more and brought it crashing down on the creature's shoulder with all his strength. The blow made no sound of flesh or bone, only a muffled metallic thud. The entity turned its head slowly toward him, its grin unchanged. From the wound seeped black smoke, as though it were bleeding shadows that carried no blood. It raised its hand with calm precision and pushed the air. An unseen force slammed into Max's chest, hurling him against the wall so hard his head cracked against the plaster. Darkness swam across his vision, and the ground tilted beneath him as though he were adrift on a ship. When he forced his eyes open, the entity loomed over him, its black gaze fixed coldly upon him, one hand pressing against his chest as though to drive him into the floor. The deep voice thundered again inside his skull. "Your place is here. Don't run." Max tried to scream, but the sound became a white vapor streaming from his mouth straight into the creature's. He felt a piece of his soul being pulled free. His head spun, his heart pounded violently, and the heat of his body drained with every breath. The entity bent closer, its vast mouth by his ear, and whispered, "In the next chapter, you will not be you."
Max woke to an unnatural cold in the room. He couldn't remember how he had fallen asleep or when he had passed out. The moment he opened his eyes, he felt half of his body heavy as if covered in iron, while the other half was light like air.
He staggered to the bathroom, but when he looked into the small mirror above the sink, his heart nearly stopped. Half his face was normal, the other half gray and frozen, with a sunken black eye and a twisted mouth. It wasn't a distortion or a trick of the light, it was real. He touched his cheek and found the skin was different, the left side warm, the right side like ice. He shivered and pulled back from the mirror, but his reflection smiled fully, even though his own mouth hadn't moved. The reflection slowly lifted its right hand, signaling for silence, then whispered softly, its voice carrying through the room, "You are melting." He stumbled back into the bedroom. Everything wavered before his eyes. The walls shifting, their colors changing, old photographs on the walls dripping like melting wax. In every corner, he glimpsed gray shadows lurking, only to vanish. He sank to the floor, struggling for breath. Half of his chest rose and fell with a normal rhythm, the other half moved slowly, heavily, releasing white vapor with every breath. Voices filled his head, all his own, but at different ages, a child's voice, a young man's, an old man's, speaking at once. In the middle of the room, the great mirror that had begun it all had grown wider. The black crack inside it was now an open doorway of darkness, dotted with faint white specks like eyes. The entity was no longer in the room, yet it was everywhere else. In the walls, in the air, in his body. He felt his right hand twitching on its own, reaching toward the mirror without his command. Against his will, Max stepped closer. His reflection in the glass was now whole, entirely gray, its smile fixed. The reflection spoke in a voice like the wind. "One step, and you'll be inside. Nothing will hurt." He tried to retreat, but the right half of his body pushed him forward. His legs dragged him toward the mirror, while the other half resisted. He screamed, "No, not me!" But his voice came out, half human, half metallic screech. He reached the edge of the mirror. The air seemed to vanish, his heartbeat slowing. The gray half of him pressed its hand into the glass. The finger slipped through it as though it were water. The other half trembled outside. He felt himself splitting in truth. One eye in darkness, one in the room. One ear hearing the voices within the mirror, the other catching the rasp of his breath. Terror had ceased to be fear. It was the sensation of losing his very identity. Suddenly, all sound vanished. Then a single phrase rang clear inside his skull. "The replacement has begun." A freezing pain stabbed through his head. He collapsed, screaming half a scream before silence swallowed it. When at last he lifted his head, he saw his body standing in the mirror, smiling, while he lay, helpless, on the floor.
Max opened his eyes and found himself standing in a place without end, a smooth black floor reflecting the sky, and above him a sky made of glass tinted with dark blue. In every direction stretched endless rows of tall, frameless mirrors. Each one held his reflection, but all were different. Some screamed, some laughed, some bled from their eyes. He tried to move, but his body felt unbearably heavy, every motion dragging as though through thick liquid. He reached out to touch one of the mirrors, and electricity shot through his arm. A voice exploded inside his head. "At last, you are where you belong." At that same instant, he saw in a large mirror before him his real body, still in his apartment, sitting on the floor, but its eyes were now entirely black. The entity was inside his body, moving, rising slowly, smiling a calm, steady smile. Max tried to scream, but all that came out was a metallic whisper. The entity, wearing his body, lifted its head and looked straight at the mirror where Max stood trapped inside. Its voice was cold. "Your turn is over. I am Max now." Max pounded on the glass from within, his fists striking the surface to no effect. Outside, the entity smiled, pressing its hand to the mirror. The touch pierced into his being like a surge of electricity. And then, in the apartment, the entity began using Max's body, opening drawers, touching objects, smelling clothes, opening and closing the door. Max could see it all from within, like watching a film of his stolen life. Around him, the inner world shifted. The walls turned to black liquid, the floor to a shining reflective surface, and the sky to a colossal eye watching him from afar. Constant whispers, all in his own voices at different ages, called to him and laughed. In a distant corner, he saw other faces in the mirrors, men, women, children, all bearing versions of his features, each with different eyes. Some reached out for help, others grinned with sinister delight. He realized then the mirror was never only his. It was a doorway that had swallowed countless souls. Desperately, he tried to cling to something real from his world, the smell of coffee, the light of morning, anything. But everything began to dissolve. His fingers turned transparent, his skin drifting into gray vapor. The entity, wearing his body, lifted its head and looked straight at the mirror where Max stood trapped inside. Its voice was cold. "Do you see? The air is wider here. The heart beats stronger. This body is mine now." Max felt a crushing pressure inside his skull, his vision blurring, voices piling up in his mind. Every voice repeated the same phrase, "You will not return." He collapsed to his knees within the world of mirrors, tears in his eyes, but he couldn't even feel them, only the cold. At the same time, he saw his body outside, walking slowly to the apartment door. It opened onto the street, and the entity stepped into the night, laughing softly as it vanished into the dark. In the final moment, before closing the door behind it, the entity raised its hand and waved to Max inside the mirror. A long smile stretched across its face. Then the apartment went dark. Max was left inside, surrounded by endless mirrors, each holding a version of himself trying to speak, but with no sound.
Max stood in the world of mirrors, gasping for breath. Time here had no meaning. Every second felt like an hour, and every hour like a heavy dream. But gradually, he began to notice that the glass itself wasn't stable. Tiny cracks moved like veins beneath skin, widening and closing again. He stepped closer to one of the mirrors and pressed his ear against it. Faint sounds reached him. Footsteps, breathing, muffled laughter. They were all from his real world, as if heard through thick water. He started knocking on the glass, at first with no result, but with each strike, whispers began to rise from the other mirrors. Among them was a different voice, weaker but clear. "There is a way, the back door." He turned toward the source and saw in a side mirror the pale face of a woman. Her eyes were blood red, her lips tightly sealed. Slowly, she opened her mouth and said, "If you break it from the inside, you'll escape, but he will come with you." Max tried to speak to her, but the voice vanished and the mirror turned black. He sat on the ground, struggling to catch his breath. His body began to tighten around him like a cage. His skin cracked, releasing faint gray light, and his left hand was transparent up to the wrist. At the same time, through a massive mirror before him, he saw the entity inhabiting his real body. It sat in his apartment on the chair, laughing coldly, while writing on the wall with its fingers. The fingers bled black ink as if they selves were pens. Rage grew stronger than fear inside him. Max stood, staring into the reflection of the entity in his real body, and said with a trembling voice, "You will not take my life so easily." He pressed both hands against the great mirror with all his strength. Its surface was freezing, so cold it burned. He pushed harder until his fingers pierced through the glass like thick liquid. At that moment, screams erupted from all the other mirrors, the overlapping screams of hundreds of voices. The glass shook beneath his hands, black lines spreading through it like a spider's web. He knew this was the back door the woman had spoken of. The more he pressed, the wider the cracks grew, and the louder the voices roared in his skull. Suddenly, the reflection of the entity in his real body noticed him. It raised its head slowly, its black eyes glowing. In a mocking tone, it said, "You're trying to escape? There is no door but me." The air in the mirror world grew 10 times heavier. The ground beneath his feet sunk. All the mirrors trembled as if about to shatter. From the corners, gray hands emerged, dozens of them, like the entity's own, stretching toward him to hold him back. He ran, weaving through endless corridors of glass. The sound of those hands followed him, whispers swelling into a thunderous roar. But ahead, he saw the widening crack in the mirror, pale light bleeding into the darkness. He reached it, thrusting his left hand into the light. Warmth surged through him for the first time in days. Yet at the very moment, icy fingers clamped onto his shoulder, yanking him backward into the dark. The entity's voice screamed inside his skull, not cold this time, but furious. "I will not let you leave."
The crack before him was like a wound in the sky, spilling faint white light. Max threw his entire body against it, half of him inside the glow, the other half still trapped in the dark. The warmth on his left side and the freezing cold on his right tore him apart, literally. From behind, long gray arms burst out of the mirrors, each with claws sharp as knives. Some wrapped around his legs, others coiled around his shoulders, dragging him back like a drowning man swallowed by a sea of hands. In the split, he saw the entity in his real body. But this time it wasn't calm or cold. Its face was grotesque, mouth stretched open down to its chest, eyes blazing red. It screamed, "You are mine. You are the door. You will not leave." Max summoned every ounce of strength, digging his nails into the edges of the crack until gray blood dripped from his fingers. The harder he pushed, the wider the wound in the glass grew, the stronger the pull from behind. He took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "Even if I escape with half my body, at least I can scream in the real world." With one final thrust, he hurled himself forward, his body tore, bones splitting, his voice echoing in 2 directions at once. At that exact moment, the entity let out a roar so deep the entire hall of mirrors trembled. Light erupted from the crack, blinding everything. The gray arms clutching him disintegrated into ash. Max pulled himself forward until his whole body plunged into the glow. When his eyes opened, he was lying on the floor of his apartment, but everything was dark. The air was heavy, and there, standing before him in his real body, was the entity, its eyes black pitch, its flesh a fusion of gray and raw skin. The entity spoke in a doubled voice, "You returned, but not as you." Max tried to move, but his body was half transparent. His hands slipped through objects, his feet barely touched the floor. He was half alive, half shadow. The entity stepped toward him, each stride leaving a trail of black across the ground, each breath burning the air. The hunt began. The entity lunged within human speed, and Max ran from room to room. The walls shifted, the apartment twisting into a labyrinth of narrow corridors lined with shattered mirrors. Everywhere he turned, endless reflections of the entity's grinning face watched him. He passed a window and froze. Outside was not his city.
The streets were black, the sky darker still, faceless people wandering aimlessly. Everything was now an echo of the mirror world. The entity leapt from wall to wall, crawling across the ceiling like liquid shadow. Its voice came from every direction. "You are half, I am half, let us become one." Max dashed toward the door, only for it to dissolve into a mirror before he could touch it. He slammed his hand against it, but it vanished into nothing. Behind him, the entity's footsteps closed in, claws scraping the floor, cold air biting at his back. Finally, he stumbled into the kitchen. On the table lay a large knife. He grabbed it, though his hand was half transparent. The blade reflected his gray face, but the steel was solid, sharp, and cold. He turned. Just a meter away stood the entity, locking eyes with him. It smiled, wide and sinister, and said, "One stab, and either I vanish or you do." At that moment, every light went out. Darkness swallowed everything. Only two things remained visible: the gleam of the knife and the burning eyes of the entity. Max raised the blade with all his strength. The entity opened its arms as if waiting for an embrace.
The room was still, everything drowned in darkness except for the glint of the knife in Max's hand and the eerie shimmer of the entity's black eyes. The silence was so heavy he could hear his heartbeat pounding like a drum in his chest. The entity stepped forward. Max instinctively stepped back. It spread its arms slowly, its grin widening to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth. Its deep voice whispered, "Come, this ends now." Max lifted the knife to his chest level, his hand trembling but firm. For the first time since it all began, he felt he had a weapon. In his head, another voice spoke, his own but clearer, sharper. "The only one who can kill it is you, because it is you." The entity lunged with inhuman speed, its arms stretching like endless shadows, reaching to seize him. At the last moment, Max thrust forward and drove the knife into the entity's chest with all his strength. The blade did not pierce flesh. It sank into something cold and solid like stone, then melted like clay. A tremendous, inhuman scream burst forth, echoing through the walls as every mirror in the place shattered at once. The entity staggered back, shrieking, clutching its chest where the blade had sunk. Thick black smoke poured from the wound, filling the room with a metallic stench, a rotting taste in the air as though the very oxygen had died. Max ripped the knife free, but in that instant he felt something tear loose from inside him, as if the thread binding them had snapped. He fell to his knees, gasping, half of his gray body now glowing faintly white, the other half returning to its natural flesh. The entity slowly lifted its head, its face cracked apart, gray skin crumbling into black dust, yet its eyes still burned. With a broken voice it hissed, "You cannot kill me. I am you." Then, in a sudden burst, it lunged forward and gripped Max's throat in one hand. The cold of its fingers was unbearable, like ropes of ice coiling around his neck. It hoisted him into the air, his legs kicking helplessly. Max could barely breathe. In a desperate surge, he raised the knife and drove it straight into the entity's face, right through the black eye. Another scream tore through the room, louder than before. The walls cracked, the ground shook, and every mirror collapsed into powder. The entity dropped him, staggering backward, clutching its face as it began to dissolve, voice breaking into whispers. "You will never escape." Max fell to the ground, coughing violently. The knife burned hot in his hand, his body trembling, but his heart hammering stronger than ever. The gray half of his form shrank, his skin slowly returning to normal, but he could still feel something lingering inside.
When he looked ahead, the entity was gone, but on the wall, its long shadow remained, still moving faintly, as though waiting for the moment to return.
Max sat on the floor, gasping for air, the knife still burning hot in his hand, the gray half of his body slowly dissolving. The air was heavy, filled with floating black dust like ashes. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of triumph, yet it was far too brief. As he looked around, he began to notice the shadows on the walls moving on their own, twisting into distorted forms. Hands, faces, open eyes. His reflection in the window was smiling, even though his lips remained still. He whispered to himself, "It's over. It has to be over." But in the far corner of the room, on the cracked tiles, the darkness started gathering again. At first, just a thin smoke, then thicker, swirling, until it formed into a wide circle. From its center, a faint white fissure appeared, glowing like the cracks of the old mirrors. From the crack came the entity's voice, weaker, yet disturbingly clear. "You opened the door. Now the door is open." Max shot to his feet, clutching the knife, eyes wide. He screamed, "You're gone! It's finished!" But the voice laughed, raspy and broken. "I never left. You pulled the world inside." The entire room shook, the walls split apart, revealing endless black mirrors behind them. The floor turned into a glassy surface, reflecting a dark sky. Everything in the apartment was gone, except him, the knife, and the door, which had become a black mirror itself. The air thickened into liquid. Each breath was like drowning. Each movement unbearably slow. Max stumbled toward the door, but it sealed itself. He slammed the knife into the glass, but the blade bounced back, its tip snapping off. From every surrounding mirror, his own face began to appear. Hundreds of Maxes, each staring with hollow eyes, some smiling, some crying, some screaming. Then one by one, they started moving out of the mirrors, slow and deliberate, hands first, then faces, then entire bodies. The whispering filled the air, but it was not the entity's voice. It was his own, multiplied, every version speaking at once. "You caused this. You opened it. You allowed it." Max raised the knife, threatening, "Stay back. I'm not you." But they pressed forward, circling him, dozens of hands reaching. Behind him, the pale fissure was still open, its light brighter now, spiraling like a vortex. He felt it pulling, not his body, but his very soul. Suddenly, from the fissure, a colossal black arm emerged, clawed fingers digging into the ground, pulling something monstrous through. The entity was no longer human-shaped. It was a shifting mass of darkness, its form mutating every second, its eyes burning like fiery holes. Its voice was now a roar. "I am no longer bound. The world itself is my mirror." Max staggered backward until his spine pressed against the cold glass. All of his replicas froze, their gazes fixed on him, as though waiting for his choice. In despair, Max raised the knife to his own chest, ready to plunge it in and end everything. But just then, another voice spoke. Clear, resonant, as if from within him. "Don't kill. Break." He turned toward the source and saw only himself in one of the mirrors. But this version of him had glowing eyes. The reflection spoke. "There is one crack left unsealed. The first crack. Break it." Max looked around, and there it was. On the far wall, above the place where he had first found the mirror, a small fissure glowing in a different color, not white, but a deep blood red.
The whole world shook around him. The sounds twisted into a long, piercing scream. The white light collapsed into darkness, and the massive entity crawled outward like a living mountain. Max saw the red crack on the far wall, small but pulsing like a beating heart, and everything inside him told him this was the origin. He ran, though the floor tilted into shards of glass, every step breaking beneath his feet, but the red crack glowed ahead like salvation. The surrounding copies of him began to dissolve into black ash, some calling his old names, some laughing in madness. The entity roared, a scream that made every mirror shudder and explode with sparks. Its arms, like the tentacles of a monstrous octopus, stretched from the void to block his path. Anything they touched turned instantly to ash. Even the air itself tasted metallic. Max ducked beneath the first arm, leapt over the second, slid across the floor until he stood right in front of the red crack. It radiated a strange heat, its blood-colored glow boiling like an open artery. At that moment, the entity drew close, its eyes burning like flames, its voice booming. "If you will not be mine, then you will be no one's." It thrust its final arm forward like a wall of darkness to stop him. Max raised the broken knife, his bleeding hand glowing with white light from within. He felt all of himself gather into this single instant. He rasped, "If I was your door, then I'll be the one to close it." And he drove the knife deep into the heart of the red crack with all his strength. The crack was not like glass, it was like living flesh. The blade sank in to the hilt, and a violent red light burst outward, blinding the whole space. The entity's scream fractured into 1,000 voices as every wall, every mirror, every shadow in the room collapsed into black ash that rose and vanished into the air. Max pulled the knife free, and the crack began to seal itself shut, knitting like a wound. The air grew heavy, a tremendous force pulling everything toward it. The entity, as huge as it was dragged into the red fissure, clawing at the glass but sliding closer, screaming. The copies of Max shouted in unison, "Close it! Close it! Close it!" Max pressed his hands against the edges of the fissure, pushing with all his might. His skin burned, seared by the heat, but the crack shrank smaller and smaller. The entity was halfway through, half inside, half outside. In one final lunge, the creature's hand gripped Max's shoulder. Its voice tore through the air like a storm. "If you close it, you close yourself." Max looked into its black eyes, breathed slowly, and whispered, "Close." He pressed harder until the fissure snapped shut, exploding in a blinding flash of red-white light. Everything collapsed into silence. When Max opened his eyes, he was back in his apartment, lying on the floor, the knife in his hand now reduced to ashes. Everything was normal. The walls, the windows, the furniture. The air was heavy, but real. Yet, in the far corner, on the wall where the red crack had once been, there remained a single dot, dark crimson, the size of an eye.
Max sat on the floor in the middle of his apartment, breathing as if he had just risen from beneath heavy water. The room looked the same as before, but its silence was strange, a silence that felt like an inner void. No street noise, no air, only the pounding of his heart. He looked at the far wall where the red fissure had been. There was no crack anymore, but a small, dark red dot remained, glimmering faintly as though it were breathing. He tried to convince himself it was just a mark, but a cold sensation along his spine told him otherwise. He stood slowly, his hands trembling. Walking toward the dot, he bent down to examine it. The closer he came, the more a whisper stirred in his head. Broken fragments of sound. "Not over, not over."
He recoiled quickly and stumbled into the chair behind him. In his memory, he heard the entity's voice again, just as he had the first time, but now weaker, like an echo fading down a deep well. He touched his chest. The skin was normal, yet beneath it, something throbbed slowly, like a second heartbeat that was not his own. He went into the bathroom and stood before the mirror. His reflection appeared normal, his face, his hair, his eyes. But when he blinked, in that brief instant, the entity's face flashed back at him, smiling, before it vanished. He forced his eyes wide open. Nothing, just himself. He whispered, "It's over. It's done." But the second heartbeat in his chest pulsed harder. He sat on the edge of the bathtub, his head in his hands. Each time he closed his eyes, he heard sounds, scratching on glass, breath against his ear, his own voice screaming from far away. That night, sitting in his room, he noticed the clock had frozen at 3:33. Every window was dark, though the street outside was lit. When he turned to the wall, he saw the red dot had grown larger. It was no longer a dot, it was the size of a small pupil, watching him wherever he went. He tried to sleep on the couch, but couldn't. Each time he closed his eyes, flashes of the mirror world came to him, endless corridors, gray hands, a cold white glow. It was as if half of him was still trapped there. At dawn he heard a faint tapping from the wall where the eye was. Soft knocks, steady, like someone rapping from the inside. He crept closer, pressed his ear to the wall. A thin whisper seeped through. "Max, open, open." He stumbled back, shivering. Grabbing his phone to call someone, anyone, he found the screen showing only images of mirrors. Mirrors filled with himself in different poses. He threw the phone to the floor, but it kept glowing, the reflections moving, showing him screaming inside them. He turned again to the wall. The red eye now blinked, opening and closing, like a real eye, staring directly at him. A breath of cold, damp air drifted out from it, like the exhalation of some living creature. Max staggered back to the center of the room, his mind fracturing. His voice trembled. "I closed the door. I closed it." The whisper answered, "You only closed half."
Max sat in the middle of the room, his back to the door, eyes fixed on the wall where the red eye was slowly widening like a living wound. The second heartbeat in his chest grew louder than his real one, filling his ears with the sound of heavy drums. The whisper was no longer a whisper, it was a clear voice now, but it was his own. "Max, open. Max, the door is not yours. The door is me." Suddenly, all the lights in the apartment went out. The street outside the windows vanished. Everything was swallowed in blackness, except for the red eye, glowing in the dark like a blood moon. He stepped toward the wall without thinking, his hand reaching out. The air had turned thick and viscous, every breath laced with the metallic stench of cold blood. When his fingers touched the wall, he felt living flesh pulsing beneath his hand. From the red eye came thin black threads like tiny hairs wrapping around his fingers, pulling his hand in. He tried to resist, but the heartbeat inside his chest dragged him forward as if it were a magnet within him. Then he heard his own voice laughing from inside his head. "You didn't close the door. You became the door." At that instant, the wall exploded. It was no longer an eye, but a massive mouth, a vortex of darkness and blood, spiraling endlessly. From within came sounds beyond comprehension, children crying, metal scraping on stone, the breath of beasts, every sound of terror he had ever heard, all at once.
The vortex sucked the air from the room. Furniture slid across the floor, papers, glass, everything pulled toward the opening. Max clung to the edge of a chair, but the chair itself began to lift. The second heartbeat in his chest throbbed like an engine, red light spilling from his eyes. He realized if he gave in, everything would vanish. If he fought, maybe he'd survive, but to where? He screamed at the top of his lungs, "I am not the door. I am not you." But his voice came out doubled, half his own, half the entity's. The black threads wrapped around his body, dragging him toward the maw. In the final moment, his hand reached the broken knife lying on the floor. Though it was ash, he grasped it. He squeezed until blood dripped from his palm. The blood touched the black threads, and they burned away in white smoke. The entity roared from within the vortex, its voice shaking the walls. "You are mine, forever." Max plunged the knife into his own chest, straight into the second heartbeat. Silence. Then an explosion of red and white light swallowed everything. When the light cleared, he found himself standing in his apartment. The wall was whole again, no eye, no crack. Everything was still. The clock on the wall read 6:06. A pale sunrise bled through the window. He breathed deeply, looked at his hands. Normal. His chest, one heartbeat. No knife, no ash. For the first time in days, he smiled. Then he heard it. Tick, tick. A faint tapping on the bathroom mirror. Slowly he walked to the bathroom, each step heavy. He opened the door. The mirror was clean, his reflection ordinary. He leaned closer. His reflection smiled back at him, a smile he hadn't made. The mirror faded into black, and one word appeared scrawled in red across the glass. Door. All the lights went out at once.